What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
My brother said, "It's just a watch," with the kind of dismissive shrug you'd expect after knocking over a plastic cup, not after losing the most meaningful thing I had left of the one man who never once let me down. That shrug hit harder than any punch could have, because it wasn't just about the watch, it was about what it meant, what it stood for, what it survived. And Kyle knew that. He knew it better than anyone, because he was there the night Grandpa Hank died, standing at the foot of the bed while I held his hand, and he pressed that old Timex into my palm with the last bit of strength he had in him. I remember every detail of that night. The rain outside was tapping soft against the window pane, the kind of rain that doesn't really fall so much as it whispers. Grandpa was pale and small in the bed, swallowed up by hospital sheets that smelled like bleach and time running out, and when he pulled off that watch and handed it to me, he said, "I want you to have this, Ivy. You're the only one who never lied to me." I didn't even realize I was crying until I saw the tears hitting the silver casing. It was scratched and the strap was worn thin in places, but that watch had seen more life than most people. He'd worn it through Vietnam, through the death of his wife, through 2 heart attacks, 3 jobs, 4 houses, and who knows how many holidays and birthdays and beer-soaked Sunday afternoons. That watch had a story baked into every second it ticked. And when he gave it to me, it felt like a small, quiet honor no one else even noticed, but I did. I noticed everything. After the funeral, which was exactly the no-frills send-off Grandpa would have wanted, no piano, no slideshow, just Hank Williams playing through a Bluetooth speaker and a cooler full of Budweiser, I kept the watch locked away. I didn't wear it. I didn't even take it out much. It felt too sacred to touch, like if I even breathed on it wrong, it would erase something irreplaceable. But about 3 months ago, Carl started bringing it up. Casual, offhand comments at first. "I always liked that watch," he said once, while pouring himself a drink at Mom's house. Then later, I think Grandpa said he wanted me to have it, too, which was funny, because Carl hadn't even visited Grandpa for the last year of his life. He was always too busy or too broke or too bitter to make the time. And now, all of a sudden, he was interested in a watch he'd ignored for decades. Still, I didn't want to make a scene. I've spent most of my adult life trying not to be the dramatic one, the over-emotional sister who takes things too personally. So when Kyle asked to borrow the watch for the weekend, said he wanted to show it to his son, the one he barely sees, the one he only started calling on birthdays after his ex threatened to change the last name, I paused. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed not to trust him. But I said yes. Because part of me still wanted to believe that maybe this was Kyle trying to reconnect with something real. Maybe he just needed a piece of Grandpa to feel grounded again. Maybe I was being too cynical, too controlling, too much. I handed over the box, told him to be careful, and watched him walk out with it like it was nothing more than a souvenir. 3 days later, when I asked for it back, he blinked like he had no idea what I was talking about. Then he scratched the back of his neck. He always does that when he lies, and muttered, "Oh right, the watch. Yeah, I must have left it in the car or something. Don't worry about it, it's just a watch." That moment, the way he said it, the way he looked right through me like I was being ridiculous, split something in me I didn't even know could be split. He didn't apologize. He didn't look guilty. He acted like it was a $5 trinket from a flea market. And that told me everything I needed to know. Kyle hadn't lost the watch. Kyle had pawned it. Or sold it. Or traded it for something cheap and selfish and short-lived. And the worst part? He thought I wouldn't do anything about it. He thought I'd let it slide, because that's what I always did. I was the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who swept things under the rug so no one had to face the mess. But not this time. Not with this. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I just nodded and said, "Okay." Then I went home, opened my laptop, and started digging. I thought about every pawn shop in town, every place he might have gone for a quick buck. I made a list. I cross-referenced the map with Kyle's usual haunts and his ex-wife's neighborhood. I searched Google reviews for mentions of vintage watches. And then I found it, a grainy photo in a Yelp review for a dusty old shop called Leo's Pawn and Gun, buried halfway down the page. The photo was blurry, But there it was, in the glass case, my grandfather's Timex, still in the box, still tucked inside the velvet lining he'd saved from 1975. I stared at that photo for a long time. My heart was thudding in my ears. Not from rage, not even from sadness, just this cold, crystallized clarity. Kyle had stolen from me. Worse, he'd stolen from Grandpa. He'd desecrated something sacred, something that didn't even belong in the same zip code as desperation or greed. And now he had no idea I'd found the place. No idea I'd already called and confirmed they still had it. No idea what I was planning next. I printed out the photo, folded it twice, and slid it into my purse. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and wrote one name in block letters at the top, Leo's pawn and gun. And underneath it, in smaller letters, he thinks I'll forget. He really doesn't know me. I didn't sleep much the night after I found the picture of the watch on the pawn shop's Yelp page, not because I was angry in the way people usually mean when they say that, but because something deeper had taken root under my skin, something colder, sharper, and entirely new. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't sadness either. It was something closer to calculation. I sat in the living room well past midnight, the glow of the laptop screen the only light in the house, staring at that photo as if I could climb through the pixels and take the watch back with my own hands. I kept replaying Kyle's face in my head, the casual way he'd brushed me off with that infuriating phrase, "It's just a watch," and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what hurt wasn't just the loss. It was the insult, the arrogance, the absolute certainty in his eyes that I wouldn't have the guts to do anything about it. And maybe that's the part that finally pushed me. Not the betrayal itself, but the assumption that I'd just swallow it like I always did, like I had when he borrowed my car and returned it with a dent and a shrug, like I had when he forgot Mom's birthday and said she wouldn't care anyway, like I had when he missed Grandpa's last Thanksgiving and claimed traffic, even though he never left town. All of it I'd let slide, because I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a dented fender or a missed phone call. This was a piece of someone who meant more to me than Kyle could ever understand, and he'd sold it off like a broken toaster. The next morning, I put on my most harmless-looking smile, the kind I used to wear back when I was still teaching, back when I needed to disarm angry parents and charming liars in equal measure. I pulled my hair into a soft bun, wore a navy sweater and jeans, nothing flashy, nothing too sharp, and drove across town to Leo's Pawn and Gun, a squat little building that looked like it had given up trying to pretend it wasn't a sad place. The sign was faded, and the bars on the windows weren't decorative. The lot was half empty. The bell over the door jingled with a weak, tinny sound as I stepped inside. It smelled like dust and oil and something faintly metallic, the scent of transactions nobody wanted to admit to. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and thick arms looked up from behind the counter. He had a face like old leather and eyes that had seen a lot more than they were willing to talk about. His name tag said Leo, which saved me the trouble of asking. I smiled politely and walked up to the counter, pretending to browse the display case, even though I already knew exactly what I was looking for. I made small talk about the weather, about the neighborhood, about nothing at all, really, and then I leaned in a little, feigning curiosity, and said, "You wouldn't happen to have any vintage watches, would you? Something from the 70s, maybe?" Leo grunted and gestured to the far end of the case, where a few older timepieces were lined up on faded velvet. And there it was, my grandfather's watch, still in the box, still bearing the faint etchings on the back that Grandpa had carved himself sometime around 1982. I felt my breath catch in my throat, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I leaned closer and said, "This one's interesting. You know anything about it?" Leo looked at it, then back at me and shrugged. "Came in 3 days ago. Guy said it was his grandfather's." I raised an eyebrow, pretending not to react, pretending I hadn't already expected that exact timeline. I asked casually if they kept a log of who sold what, for insurance reasons, of course, and Leo, who seemed more tired than suspicious, confirmed that yes, they did, but it wasn't for public viewing. I nodded, smiled, and then pulled a card from my wallet, the one with my real estate license and the top agent of the quarter, badge embossed on the corner. "I understand," I said, all sweet professionalism. It's just, I think someone stole this from me. And if that's the case, well, we might both be holding stolen property. That made him pause. I watched his fingers twitch a little as they hovered over the drawer. Listen, lady, he said, lowering his voice, I don't want trouble. I just buy what people bring me. I softened my voice even further, tilted my head like I was asking for a personal favor, and said, I don't want trouble either. I just want to know who brought it in. Then I'll go away and this whole thing can stay off the books. Leo stared at me for a long second, then nodded once and ducked into the back room. He returned a moment later with a clipboard, tapped a page near the bottom, and there it was, Kyle's name. Full name. Signature. A copy of his license number, too. He'd walked in 3 days ago and sold the watch for $60. 60. That was the price he'd put on a lifetime of memories. I stared at the page until my eyes started to sting. Then I asked the question I'd been holding back since I walked in, you got cameras? Leo hesitated. For security, I added quickly. If it was really stolen. He gave me a wary look but finally, slowly, nodded again. We keep 3 days of footage. After that, it loops. I checked the date. This was the 3rd day. Barely. I asked if I could see it. He crossed his arms, and I knew I was pushing it now, so I offered a different path. How about this, I said, you let me see it, and I promise I won't bring this to the police unless I have to. Leo sighed and went to the back again, and this time he returned with a grainy recording pulled up on a little black monitor. He hit play, and there he was, Kyle, in his Red Sox hoodie, pacing near the counter, glancing around like he was late for something. He pulled the watch box from his coat pocket, set it down without ceremony, and leaned in as he talked to Leo, smiling, laughing even. Like it was nothing. I didn't say anything for a long while after the footage ended. I just stood there, watching the frozen frame of Kyle's smirk on the screen. Then I turned to Leo and said, can I get a copy of that? He looked like he didn't want to ask why. He just nodded, burned it to a USB, slipped it into a plain manila envelope, and handed it over like he was passing me a loaded gun. I thanked him, paid cash for the watch, and walked out into the sunlight with a strange, electrified calm settling over me. As I drove home, the envelope resting on the passenger seat like a secret weapon, I asked myself the question I knew I'd never be able to answer honestly. What would I have done if it had been a stranger? If someone I didn't know had stolen something so personal, so sacred? Would I have let it go, accepted it as the cost of living in a broken world? Or would I have done what I was about to do now, not out of vengeance, but because I needed him to feel what he thought I never could? I already knew the answer. And Kyle had no idea what was coming. By the time Sunday rolled around, the air had already started to change, not just outside, where the season was slowly shifting from the clinging heat of late summer into the brittle hints of an early fall, but inside me too, where something far colder had begun to settle, something sharp and quiet and deliberate. I hadn't told a soul about what I discovered at Leo's pawn and gun, hadn't mentioned the video, the logbook, the pitiful $60 he'd traded that watch for, or the ugly little smile he wore when he did it. I said nothing to Mom, though every time she brought up Kyle in conversation, asking if he'd found a new job, if he was still trying to rebuild, if he was okay, I had to bite down on the inside of my cheek to stop myself from snapping something bitter and final. I didn't want her to know yet. Not because I was trying to protect Kyle, but because I was setting the stage, and I needed the scene to be exactly right, every prop in its place, every word timed like a ticking clock. I sent the group text early Friday morning, cheerful and casual, just the way they expected from me. I wrote, family dinner at my place Sunday. Pot roast and red wine. Old school, just like Grandpa liked it. Kyle replied first with a thumbs up and a lame joke about showing up for free food, and Mom responded a few hours later saying she'd bring her pecan pie and asked if I still had those folding chairs in the garage. I confirmed that I did, added a smiley face for good measure, and spent the rest of the day preparing, not the meal, not the table settings, but the trap. I tested the USB drive twice on the living room television, making sure the file loaded quickly and the volume was high enough to catch every word. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't need to be. Kyle's voice was unmistakable, and so was the way he glanced over his shoulder before handing over the box like it was filled with old socks instead of the most valuable thing our grandfather had ever owned. I didn't need him to confess. I already had his confession burned onto a flash drive, etched into a pawn shop receipt, and stitched into the back of my mind like a scar that would never fade. I didn't want an apology. I wanted the lie to die on his face in front of the one person who'd always given him the benefit of the doubt. Sunday came faster than expected, and the house smelled like rosemary and slow-roasted beef by the time they arrived. Mom was first, always early, always carrying more Tupperware than she needed, chatting about traffic and her book club and the neighbor's dog who kept digging up her tulips. Kyle came 10 minutes later, wearing jeans and a button-up that still had a plastic tag hanging awkwardly from the hem, like he'd bought it on the way over and couldn't be bothered to check the mirror. He kissed Mom on the cheek, handed her a bottle of cheap wine, and gave me a nod that was supposed to look casual, but underneath I could see it, that vague twitch in his jaw that told me he was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Maybe he sensed something was coming. Maybe he didn't. Either way, he hadn't seen the video. Not yet. Dinner passed in the usual rhythm, small talk and laughter stitched together by shared memories and shallow questions, the kind of evening we'd had 100 times before. I poured the wine, passed the potatoes, listened while Kyle recounted some story about running into his old college roommate at the grocery store, pretending to be amused even as the words washed over me like static. I let him talk. I let Mom compliment the food. I let the moment breathe long enough to feel normal, ordinary, safe. And then, right as dessert was being served, Mom cutting the pie into 2 small slices because she always worried about calories, Kyle reaching for the whipped cream with that lazy, self-satisfied smirk. I stood up, walked over to the television, and plugged in the USB drive. No one noticed at first. The screen flickered from black to grainy gray, and then the footage began to play. It was him, plain as day, standing in the middle of Leo's pawn and gun with his shoulders hunched and his hands fidgeting in his jacket pockets. The box appeared next, cradled in his fingers like something worthless, like it didn't weigh anything at all. He set it down, leaned on the counter, and laughed, while Leo filled out the paperwork. And then he pocketed the cash, turned, and walked out like a man who hadn't just sold his own bloodline. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that feels physical, like a wall slamming down between you and the rest of the world. Mom stopped mid-bite, fork frozen in the air, her eyes locked on the screen with a look I'd never seen on her face before, something between confusion and heartbreak and recognition. Kyle didn't move for a long second. Then, slowly, like he was waking from a dream, he turned toward me, his mouth opening just a little, just enough to start forming a sentence that would never make it all the way out. "I can explain." "No," I said, my voice calm, quiet, sharper than any scream could have been. "You can't. And you don't need to. I already did the work for you." I walked back to the table, picked up my glass, and took a slow sip while the screen behind me froze on his face, mid-laugh, caught in a loop that said more than any apology ever could. Mom pushed her plate away, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Kyle," she said, "tell me this isn't what it looks like." But he didn't say anything. Not really. He stammered, blamed hard times, said something about being behind on rent, about planning to buy it back, about me blowing things out of proportion, the same tired string of excuses he'd always used like band-aids over bullet holes. I let him ramble. I wanted her to hear every syllable. Then, when he finally stopped talking, out of breath and out of lies, I stood up and said, "You're not just a thief, Kyle. You're a coward. And the worst part is, you still think people should forgive you for it." He stood, too, now desperate, now angry. "It's just a damn watch, Ivy." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not. It never was. But you were too selfish to understand that." Mom didn't say anything else. She just stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out the front door without even finishing her pie. Kyle followed, but she didn't look back. And when he tried to slam the door behind him, it didn't quite catch. It bounced open just enough to let the silence settle back into the room. I sat alone for a long time after they left, the TV screen still paused, the air still thick with the scent of pot roast and broken illusions. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. Like I'd finally ripped off a bandage that had been festering for years, and all that was left underneath was scar tissue and silence. But I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. I had imagined, perhaps naively, that after the dinner, after the video played and the truth was dragged out into the light like something rotting beneath the floorboards, Kyle would have the sense to stay quiet, to slink away into the shadows of his shame and disappear for a while, if not out of guilt, then at least out of self-preservation. I thought that maybe, finally, he'd recognize the limits of what I was willing to tolerate, and retreat into that space where people go when they've been found out, caught red-handed, and robbed of their usual excuses. But if there was one thing I should have remembered, and I had known it, I had always known it, it was that Kyle didn't respond to exposure with humility. He responded to it like a cornered animal, lashing out not because he felt guilty, but because he hated being seen for what he truly was. He showed up at my house 2 days later, not with flowers or an apology or even a borrowed tone of regret, but with that forced, slippery smile he always wore when he wanted something and didn't want to earn it. He rang the doorbell 3 times, insistent, impatient, and when I opened the door and saw him standing there, hands in his pockets, shifting from foot to foot like a teenager trying to talk his way out of detention, I knew he wasn't here to apologize. He was here to manage the fallout, to do damage control, to negotiate the terms of his own rehabilitation in our mother's eyes and, more importantly, in the eyes of anyone else who might have seen that video or heard about what he did. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and I let him, not because I wanted him there, but because I wanted to see what kind of lie he'd lead with, what flavor of denial he'd choose now that the usual ones had failed. He started with the predictable lines, the stress, the money, the pressure, the feeling of being overlooked in the family, of being treated like a screw-up from the beginning, like he never had a chance to prove himself. He painted a picture of himself as a victim, as someone backed into a corner with no way out, someone who hadn't meant to hurt anyone, someone who'd intended to buy the watch back all along and just hadn't gotten the chance. I let him speak. I sat on the edge of the couch with my arms crossed and my face unreadable, and I watched as he twisted himself into a pretzel of self-pity, the kind of performance that might have worked on mom, on friends, on women who didn't know any better. But it didn't work on me, because I had seen the tape. I had heard his voice. I had watched him walk away with cash in his pocket and zero hesitation in his step. When he finally stopped talking, when the well of justification ran dry, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Look, I know you're angry. But do you really have to keep that video? Can't we just delete it? I mean, you've made your point." There it was, the ask. The real reason he'd come. I smiled slowly, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, and said, "It's backed up in 3 places. One of them's not even in this state. So if you're thinking about pulling anything stupid, don't." For a flicker of a second, I saw something hard and ugly pass across his face, something that looked less like remorse and more like a threat half swallowed. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He just nodded tightly and left. But that night, something shifted. It started small. My work laptop, the one I kept on a table near the back door, was gone. No broken lock, no signs of forced entry. Just gone. I didn't notice it at first, not until the next morning when I sat down to finalize some documents for a closing and realized the machine had vanished like it had never existed. I checked the cameras outside the house, nothing. The motion light hadn't been triggered. There were no footprints on the grass, no evidence at all, which told me one thing: whoever took it either knew how to get in quietly, or they had a key. That same afternoon, as I walked out to my car, I saw the slow, sinking angle of the front left tire, sagging into the driveway like a balloon left out in the sun too long. A nail maybe, I thought. Maybe just a coincidence. But when I found the second tire flat by sunset, I stopped pretending it was anything but deliberate. I filed a police report, not because I expected them to do much, but because I needed the documentation. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, an old friend from high school, now a local patrol officer who owed me a favor for helping his sister close on her first home. I explained the situation, gave him the short version of the family drama, the pawn shop, the video, the sudden misfortunes that had begun to stack like cards in a losing hand. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just said, "You should know something. Your brother's got more going on than you think. We've had his name come up in a couple reports. Nothing that stuck. But you're not the first one he's tried to squeeze." The phrase hung in the air like a bad smell. You're not the first. I sat in my kitchen after the call ended, fingers pressed to my temple, staring at the glass of untouched wine in front of me. My mind was racing, not with panic, not even with anger, but with clarity, the clarity of knowing that what I was dealing with wasn't just a brother who made a bad choice, but a man who had crossed over into something darker. Someone who didn't just bend the truth, but dismantled it, shaped it, weaponized it. And if he thought I was going to be another one of his loose ends, someone to manipulate, to gaslight, to silence, he was going to learn the hard way just how wrong he'd been. Because I hadn't even started. By the time I sat down at my desk late that Thursday evening, the kitchen window fogging faintly from the cooling night air and the low hum of the refrigerator keeping me company in the quiet, I had stopped asking myself whether or not I was overreacting. Because somewhere between the erased boundaries and the flattened tires and the smug expression on Kyle's face when he asked me to delete the video, I had come to understand something that had taken me far too long to admit out loud, that this wasn't about a watch anymore, not really, and maybe it never had been. What Kyle took from me when he handed over that small silver box for $60 wasn't just an object, wasn't just some heirloom or outdated accessory, but the last tangible piece of a man who had anchored my childhood with his quiet dignity, who had given me strength when I was too young to understand what strength meant, who had loved me without conditions or performances or lies. And Kyle, whether out of desperation or entitlement or some deep-rooted spite he couldn't even name, had spat on that memory in a way I couldn't just forgive and certainly couldn't forget. But revenge, or at least the brand of justice I was about to serve, wasn't going to be loud or vengeful or dripping with dramatics. It wasn't going to involve screaming in driveways or slamming doors or pointless arguments that ended with nothing resolved and everything broken further. No, this had to be precise. Surgical. Something he wouldn't see coming until it was already too late to claw his way out. And above all, it had to hurt, not physically, not in any cheap or sensational sense, but in that private, humiliating way that lingers long after everyone else has stopped talking about it. The kind of pain that erodes reputation and self-image and leaves you looking in the mirror and wondering how you let it all fall apart. So I posted the video, not on some public platform or viral channel where strangers could laugh and move on without context, but in a carefully selected Facebook group that included every living member of our extended family, several of Kyle's old friends, a few of his ex-coworkers, and, most importantly, his ex-wife, who still shared custody of their 7-year-old son and had always suspected Kyle wasn't nearly as reformed as he liked to pretend. The caption I wrote was short, deliberate, and sharp enough to draw blood without needing to shout, "Family can cut the deepest." Especially when they think no one's watching. I didn't have to wait long. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing with messages, some shocked, some supportive, some hesitant and wrapped in that awkward tone people use when they know they've been turning a blind eye for years and don't quite know how to say "I should have believed you sooner." Mom called 3 times before I answered, her voice tight and trembling, caught somewhere between heartbreak and fury, and while she didn't defend him, not this time, she did ask, in that weary way only mothers can, if maybe I'd gone too far. If maybe there was another way. I told her the truth. I'd already tried every other way. This was the last one I had left. Kyle, on the other hand, didn't text, didn't call, didn't so much as send a passive-aggressive email, which was probably the most telling part of all. Because silence, when it came from him, was never peace, it was strategy. It meant he was scrambling, not for redemption, but for leverage, for a way to twist the story, spin it into something that made him look like the victim, something he could sell to whoever still had the stomach to listen. But this time, The evidence spoke louder than his charm. Within 72 hours, Call lost his job. His boss, it turned out, had seen the video after someone anonymously forwarded it to the company's HR department, and while no one said the word theft, the implication was enough to seal his fate. His ex-wife filed for a temporary custody suspension, citing character concerns, and though I wasn't directly involved, I received a message from her late that night that simply said, "Thank you for everything." It wasn't joy I felt reading that. It wasn't triumph or satisfaction or any of those cathartic emotions people like to write about when the villain finally gets what's coming to them. It was something quieter, heavier. A kind of release that didn't heal so much as acknowledge the wound. Because even though I'd exposed him, even though I'd pulled the curtain back and let the world see what I had seen all along, I hadn't won anything. I had only stopped losing. I bought the watch back from Leo, who gave it to me in a small velvet bag with a sheepish nod and a muttered apology he didn't need to say, because he hadn't been the one to betray me. When I got home, I took it out and held it in my palm for a long time, feeling the weight of it, not just in ounces but in years, in moments, in all the things it had survived. Then I took it to a jeweler and had something engraved into the back, just beneath Grandpa's original initials. Nothing poetic, nothing vengeful, just a simple line of truth that only I would ever fully understand. Never lie to someone who remembers everything. Now I wear the watch. Not every day, not to flaunt it or flash it around like some kind of trophy, but often enough to feel it pulse against my wrist like a heartbeat, like a reminder. And every time I glance down at it, I remember exactly what it took to bring it back home, and I remind myself that sometimes protecting what matters means doing things you never thought you'd do, things that change the way people look at you, that stain your hands even as they protect your heart. Some might say I went too far, that I crossed a line, that airing family dirt in front of others is a betrayal in itself, but I don't lose sleep over those opinions anymore. Because when someone breaks something sacred and then calls you dramatic for caring, they don't deserve your silence. They deserve your clarity. A week later, just when the dust had begun to settle and the silence around Kyle had grown too thick to ignore, I received a message, no name, no greeting, just a short, biting sentence that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. You think you won. But you forgot one thing. There was no follow-up, no context, no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew that tone. I knew the rhythm of his threats, the way he laced cowardice with bravado. It was Kyle reminding me that he wasn't finished, that people like him never accept endings they didn't write. And yet, when I looked down at the watch on my wrist, ticking steady and calm, I realized something that I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. He could keep fighting, keep spinning, keep clawing for a version of the story where he wasn't the villain. But the truth had already been carved into the metal, into memory, into silence. And this time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because he might have started this war with a lie and a shrug, but I was the one who finished it with the truth. And now, it was his turn to remember everything.